Welcome to Quietly Made. I am so glad you have found your way here tonight. This is a space for the curious and the weary, a place where we explore the vast, invisible infrastructures of our world, while giving your mind the permission it needs to simply rest. Before we begin, I invite you to join our community by subscribing and leaving a comment. I often wonder where these stories find you tonight. If you feel inclined, please leave a comment sharing what part of the world you are in and the hour you are settling into sleep. It is a small way for us to feel the quiet connection of this community, scattered across different time zones, but sharing this same moment of rest. If you fall asleep, that is exactly what should happen. You are safe here. You can always come back tomorrow and pick up exactly where you left off. Adjust your pillow. Take a deep, slow breath in and let it out. Let your mind drift as we begin. There was a time, not so very long before our own, when the inside of a human body was a place no living eye had ever seen, not truly seen. A surgeon of that era could feel the warmth of skin beneath their palm, could press 2 fingers along the edge of a rib cage and guess, from years of practice, what might be wrong beneath it. But guessing was the whole of the art. The body was a sealed room, and every door into it required a blade. Picture the operating room of that distant afternoon. Wooden floors, scrubbed pale by years of carbolic soap. Tall windows angled to catch the north light, because north light was steady, and steady light was all a surgeon had to work by. No humming machines, no soft glow of a monitor in the corner, just daylight, a basin of water slowly clouding pink, and the quiet, concentrated breathing of people trying to solve a problem they could not see. Consider what it meant, physically, to be a healer before imaging existed. If a patient arrived clutching their side, pale and sweating, the only way to know what stirred beneath the surface was to open the surface itself. An incision was not simply treatment, it was investigation. The scalpel served as both the question and, if the surgeon was fortunate, the answer. Exploratory surgery, they called it later, though at the time it was simply surgery, full stop. There was no other kind. Imagine the weight of that uncertainty settling into a surgeon's hands. Every cut carried 2 risks bound together: the risk of the illness itself and the risk of not finding it in time or finding it too late, tucked behind an organ that hadn't been considered. Patients were opened along the abdomen in long, careful lines, and surgeons worked by feel as much as by sight, fingers moving between loops of intestine, like someone reading in the dark, searching for the one page that had been marked. There is a particular kind of stillness in old surgical accounts from this period, a stillness born not of calm, but of concentration so total it left no room for anything else. A surgeon's hands, gloved in thin cotton or nothing at all, moving with a deliberate slowness that had nothing to do with elegance and everything to do with survival. Every motion had to be reversible in intention, even if not in fact. There was no second look inside. Once the wound was closed, the body kept its secrets again, at least until it didn't. Bone fractures were set by touch and sound. The soft grind of misaligned edges, a particular give beneath the fingers that experienced hands learned to recognize, the way a carpenter learns the grain of wood. A broken limb was splintered based on the shape it seemed to want to return to. Sometimes the approximation was close enough. Sometimes it was not, and the limb healed slightly wrong, a quiet record of the limits of feeling alone. In quiet hospital wards, lit by gas lamps, the long nights were filled with a particular kind of waiting to see if the body would confirm or deny what the hands had guessed. A fever that refused to break might mean infection deep in tissue no one could examine without cutting again. Sound gave clues, touch gave clues, but neither gave certainty. Yet even as this culture of careful, patient guesswork settled into medicine, something unrelated was stirring far away, in laboratories filled with glass tubes and the faint hum of early electrical current, where a handful of curious researchers were beginning to notice something strange happening at the edges of their experiments. A kind of light that behaved unlike any light studied before. A glow that seemed to pass through solid matter, as though matter itself were only a suggestion. They did not yet know what they had found. They only knew it was worth watching closely, in the patient, unhurried way that discovery so often begins, not with a sudden burst of understanding, but with a small, persistent curiosity about something slightly out of place. A shadow where no shadow should be. A faint fog on a photographic plate left too near a piece of equipment. The kind of detail easy to dismiss and easy for the right kind of mind to notice instead. That noticing is where our story truly begins tonight. Not with the moment the body became visible, but with the long, dim, patient corridor of need that came before it. The centuries of careful hands working blind. The quiet accumulation of frustration and hope that made the coming discovery not just interesting, but necessary. Somewhere, a door was about to open in the wall of the body. But first, for a little longer, let us sit in the dark with those who came before and understand exactly what it was they were missing and exactly how much they wanted, more than almost anything, simply to see. Let us stay a while longer in that world before seeing, because understanding what was missing helps us appreciate, with a slower and fuller kind of gratitude, what eventually arrived to fill the gap. Consider the specific texture of not knowing. Not knowing is not simply an absence. It has a weight of its own, a particular kind of pressure that settles into every decision a healer makes. Picture a physician standing at a bedside, one hand resting lightly on a patient's abdomen, feeling for the subtle firmness that might mean something has gone wrong beneath the surface. The pads of the fingers press in a slow, deliberate rhythm, testing for resistance, for tenderness, for the small telltale signs that trained hands learn to read, the way a sailor reads the surface of water for what moves beneath it. This was not primitive. It was, in its own way, extraordinarily refined. Generations of careful observation had taught healers to notice things the untrained hand would miss entirely. The faint warmth of inflamed tissue, the particular give of fluid gathering where it should not, the rigid guarding of muscles protecting an injury too painful to name. And yet, for all its refinement, touch had a hard boundary. It could not see through bone. It could not distinguish with certainty between a shadow of scar tissue and the shadow of something new and unwelcome growing in its place. A physician's fingers could trace the outer edge of a swelling and estimate its size, its firmness, its position relative to other structures, but they could never truly know what it was made of or how deep its roots extended until a blade opened the question directly. There is something almost meditative in imagining the discipline this demanded. Healers of this era developed a heightened sensitivity in their hands, an awareness of pressure and texture that modern practitioners, surrounded by scanning technology, rarely need to cultivate to the same degree. Their fingertips became instruments of genuine precision, trained over years to detect the faintest irregularities beneath skin and muscle. It was a skill passed down through careful apprenticeship, watched and practiced and slowly internalized, much like the way a musician learns to hear a single instrument slightly out of tune within a full orchestra. But sensitivity, however refined, has limits that no amount of practice can overcome. Touch cannot penetrate more than a few layers deep. It cannot see the fine branching of vessels feeding an organ, or the precise boundary between healthy tissue and something that does not belong. And so, alongside every diagnosis made by careful hands, there lived an undercurrent of humility, an acknowledgement, spoken or unspoken, that certainty simply was not available. The best a healer could offer was an informed and careful guess, built from years of pattern recognition, but a guess nonetheless. There was, in this way, a strange dignity to the uncertainty itself, a professional honesty that modern medicine, for all its precision, sometimes struggles to preserve. This was the atmosphere, then, into which the earliest glimmers of a new kind of seeing would eventually arrive, not as a sudden burst of clarity, but as a slow, almost accidental unfolding, the way morning light gradually reveals a room that has sat all night in darkness. Somewhere, researchers working with strange new forms of energy were beginning to notice faint, ghostly patterns appearing where none should exist. Photographic plates left near certain equipment showed unexplained fogging. Materials that should have blocked light entirely seemed, mysteriously, to let something through. No one yet understood the full significance of what they were observing. The connections between these strange laboratory curiosities and the deep, patient need of medicine, the centuries of hands working blind, healers making their best careful guesses in rooms lit only by daylight and candle flame, had not yet been drawn. But the two threads were moving, slowly and independently, toward a point where they would meet. One thread was need, old, deep and patient, worn smooth by generations of careful hands doing their best with what little certainty they had. The other was curiosity, small, strange, and largely unnoticed, flickering at the edges of unrelated experiments in laboratories far removed from any hospital ward. It would take time for these two threads to find each other, but find each other They eventually did, and when they finally met, the quiet, patient world of touch and inference would begin, slowly and irreversibly, to change. Somewhere in a modest laboratory, in a room kept deliberately dark for the sensitivity of certain experiments, a researcher was working late with a glass tube, sealed, evacuated of most of its air, fitted with metal terminals at either end. When an electrical current passed through it, something happened inside that tube that no one fully understood yet. The glass itself began to glow faintly, a pale greenish light pooling against the curve of the vessel. And this glow was interesting enough on its own to hold a curious mind's attention for hours. But it was not the glow itself that mattered most. It was what happened just outside the tube, in the surrounding darkness, that changed everything. A small screen coated with a chemical compound, sitting some distance away on a nearby workbench, began to shimmer faintly whenever the tube was active, even though the tube itself was wrapped in black paper, thick enough to block ordinary light completely. Something was passing through that paper. Something invisible, weightless, and entirely unfamiliar was traveling from inside the sealed glass, through solid material, and landing on that distant screen with enough energy to make it glow. Imagine the particular quality of that moment, not a triumphant realization, but a quiet, almost unsettling confusion. The researcher would have paused, checked the wrapping around the tube, perhaps assumed some flaw in the seal was letting ordinary light escape. But careful testing ruled this out again and again. The paper was intact. The room was dark. And still, every time the tube was switched on, that distant screen answered with its faint, ghostly shimmer, as though some invisible thread connected the two objects across the space between them. What followed was a period of careful, methodical testing, the kind of work that rarely gets celebrated but forms the true backbone of discovery. Different materials were placed between the tube and the screen. Paper first, then thin wood, then books, then metal of varying thickness. Dense materials blocked the effect almost entirely. Lighter materials allowed it through with only minor dimming. And then, in a moment that has become one of the most quietly significant in the history of human seeing, a hand was placed between the tube and the screen. Not deliberately at first, perhaps simply reaching to adjust something nearby. And there, on the glowing screen, appeared a shape. Not the solid silhouette of a hand as ordinary shadow would produce, but something stranger and more revealing. The soft outline of flesh, faint and translucent, with denser shadows tracing the unmistakable architecture of bone underneath. Finger joints, the delicate curve of knuckles, a shape that was unmistakably human and unmistakably interior, something no living eye had ever witnessed on a living hand, intact and unopened. Consider the silence that must have followed, the particular kind of stillness that settles over a person who has just seen something the world was not yet ready to explain. Here was a hand, a familiar, ordinary hand, the same kind attached to every person who has ever lived, rendered suddenly transparent, its hidden skeletal structure laid bare without a single incision, without a drop of blood, without the years of trained inference that touch alone required. The bones were simply there, visible, undeniable, glowing faintly against the dark backdrop of the screen. This discovery did not announce itself with any great commotion. It began, as most true discoveries do, in careful repetition, testing again and again and again, to be certain the effect was real and not some trick of fatigue or faulty equipment. Photographic plates were introduced next, capturing the image permanently rather than relying on the fleeting glow of the screen. And when those plates were developed, they held something the world had never possessed before: a lasting, reproducible image of the living human interior, made not through surgery, but through nothing more than an invisible form of energy, passing quietly through skin and muscle and settling with remarkable clarity on the harder architecture of bone. The implications rippled outward slowly at first, the way any genuinely new idea takes time to be understood even by the people who discover it. But within those first images, grainy, imperfect, faintly ghost-like by later standards, lived the seed of everything that would eventually follow. The centuries of blind, careful hands, the patient guesswork of healers working only by touch and sound. All of it stood, quietly, at the edge of a threshold that had just been crossed for the very first time. Word of this strange new light traveled slowly at first, the way important discoveries often do before their significance becomes obvious. It moved through letters between researchers, through small demonstrations in university halls, through cautious articles in scientific journals that struggled to categorize something so unlike anything previously described. There was no established word for it yet in common use, so early accounts often referred to it simply as a new kind of ray, an unfamiliar visitor in the long catalogue of natural phenomena. Picture the reaction in those early demonstration rooms. Rows of curious onlookers gathered close, watching as a hand was placed behind a small wooden box and its bones appeared, ghostly and pale, on a screen or photographic plate for everyone to see. There is something almost theatrical in imagining these early public displays, equal parts scientific presentation and quiet spectacle. People who had spent their entire lives accepting the body as a sealed private container were suddenly watching its hidden architecture rendered visible in front of them, and the emotional response ranged from delighted fascination to genuine unease. Unease is worth sitting with for a moment, because it reveals something true about how significant this shift really was. To see one's own bones, alive and moving, was to confront a kind of vulnerability previously unimaginable. The skin, which had always served as both physical and psychological boundary, suddenly seemed less absolute. Some early subjects reportedly found the experience unsettling in ways they struggled to articulate, a discomfort less about physical safety and more about a quiet philosophical vertigo. The sense that the boundary between inside and outside had just proven far more permeable than anyone expected. Meanwhile, in medical circles, a different reaction was taking hold, one driven less by a philosophical unease and more by immediate, practical recognition. Physicians who had spent careers relying on touch and inference understood almost instantly what this new capability might mean. Here, potentially, was a way to see a broken bone's true alignment without opening the limb at all. A way to locate a lodged object or a fracture hidden beneath swelling too severe for fingers to interpret reliably. The implications for surgery were immediate, though the early medical community tended toward careful, understated language, even in the face of genuinely significant change. Early experiments in applying this discovery to actual patients were, by necessity, tentative and imprecise. The equipment involved was fragile and temperamental, requiring lengthy exposure times during which a patient needed to remain almost perfectly still. No small feat for someone injured or nervous about an unfamiliar procedure. Imagine the patience required on both sides, the technician carefully adjusting the glass tube's position, while the patient held their breath and their limbs steady, trusting a process that had existed at that point for only a very short time. The images produced in these early years were far from the crisp, detailed pictures that would eventually become standard. They were often faint, sometimes blurred by even slight movement, requiring genuine skill to interpret correctly. A physician examining one of these early images had to combine the new visual information with the older, established skills of touch and clinical judgment, layering this novel form of sight on top of centuries of accumulated bedside experience, rather than replacing that experience outright. In many ways, the earliest years of this technology were less about replacing old methods and more about supplementing them, adding one new, imperfect tool to a much older toolkit built from generations of careful hands. Still, even in its earliest, roughest form, something fundamental had shifted. For the first time in the long history of medicine, the interior of a living body could be witnessed without violating its surface. A door that had always required a blade to open could now, under the right conditions, simply be looked through. It was imperfect. It was fragile, slow, and often difficult to interpret. But it was real, and it was the first small thread in what would become, over many decades, an entirely new relationship between the healer and the hidden architecture of the human form. Word of this capability spread from laboratory to laboratory, from hospital to hospital, carried by physicians eager to bring this new form of sight into their own practices. And with that spread came the next great challenge. Not simply discovering that such seeing was possible, but learning how to make it reliable, safe, and useful enough to become a true part of medical practice rather than a passing curiosity. There is a particular kind of momentum that builds once a discovery proves genuinely useful. Not sudden, not explosive, but slow and steady, the way water gathers behind a dam one drop at a time until almost imperceptibly an entirely new landscape has formed. This was the shape of what followed those first ghostly images of bone. Hospitals that had operated for generations without any form of internal imaging began, one by one, to acquire the fragile glass tubes and delicate equipment needed to produce them. It happened unevenly, first in larger city hospitals with resources to spare, then gradually spreading outward to smaller institutions as the equipment became slightly more affordable and considerably more reliable. Picture the arrival of one of these early machines at a hospital that had never possessed anything like it before. A dedicated room would be set aside, often a converted storage space or an underused corner of the building, because this new technology required something no other department needed: darkness and isolation from interference. The walls might be lined with heavy fabric to block stray light. The windows, if any remained, would be covered entirely. Staff learned, through trial and careful instruction, how to handle the glass tubes with the kind of reverence usually reserved for the most delicate laboratory instruments, aware that a single crack or improper handling could render the entire apparatus useless. Consider the strange new role that emerged in hospitals during this period. The technician, a position that had not existed in medicine before, now suddenly essential. These individuals developed a specialized expertise entirely their own, distinct from both the surgeon's blade work and the physician's diagnostic reasoning. They learned to read gauges with uncertain calibration, to judge exposure times through experience rather than precise measurement. Their hands developed a particular sensitivity to the equipment itself, a feel for the correct hum of a properly functioning tube, an ear for the subtle change in sound that might indicate a problem developing before it became visible. The photographic plates used to capture these early images required their own careful handling, their own darkened processing rooms where chemical baths transformed exposed glass into readable images. Imagine the quiet, almost ceremonial atmosphere of one of these processing rooms. The sharp, mineral scent of developing solution hanging in the air, the faint red glow of a safe light casting everything in dim crimson, and the slow, suspenseful moment when a plate was lifted from its bath and held up to check whether the image had captured cleanly or whether some flaw in exposure or handling had rendered it useless, requiring the entire process to begin again. Errors were common in these early years, and each one carried real cost. The expense of wasted materials, the burden placed on patients who might need to repeat an uncomfortable procedure. Yet even these errors served a purpose, slowly building a body of practical knowledge that no textbook could yet provide. Technicians learned, through repeated trial, exactly how long an exposure needed to be for a hand versus a chest, exactly how to position a limb to avoid the blurring caused by even slight movement. As this practical knowledge accumulated, something else began to shift as well. The medical community's understanding of what this new form of seeing was actually good for. Early enthusiasm had imagined almost limitless application, but experience quickly revealed both strengths and boundaries. Bone, dense and clearly defined, produced sharp, readable images with relative ease. Softer tissues proved far more difficult, their subtler variations in density blending together into images too faint or ambiguous to interpret with confidence. This distinction mattered enormously, shaping which medical problems this new technology could genuinely help solve, and which remained for now still hidden behind the older limitations of touch and inference. Surgeons began incorporating these images into their preparation in ways that felt, at the time, remarkable in their practical value. A fracture could now be studied before treatment began, its exact alignment understood in advance rather than estimated through touch alone. A foreign object lodged somewhere in the body could be located with genuine precision, its position mapped before a single incision was made. The blind, exploratory nature of surgery, the defining characteristic of the healer's work for centuries, was beginning slowly and unevenly to change into something more deliberate, more capable of planning before acting, rather than discovering only once the body had already been opened. Let us linger a little longer in this era of accumulation, because it deserves more attention than history often grants it. The great discovery had already happened. What remained was slower, quieter work, the long, patient labor of turning a laboratory curiosity into something a hospital could depend on, day after day, without failure. Picture the physical wear this placed on the earliest machines. The glass tubes at the heart of the process were fragile in ways that modern equipment rarely is, prone to overheating during extended use, their thin walls sometimes cracking under the strain of repeated operation. A technician working a full day of examinations learned to listen for subtle changes in the equipment's hum, a slight shift in pitch that might signal the tube was nearing the end of its usable life. Replacement was costly and often required waiting for new components to arrive, so operators developed an almost protective relationship with their equipment, nursing failing tubes along for as many additional examinations as safety would reasonably allow. Consider, too, the physical toll this new practice took on the people operating it, a cost not fully understood until years of cumulative exposure had passed. Early technicians and researchers, working closely and repeatedly with this new form of energy, sometimes noticed changes in their skin, a persistent redness, a dryness no ordinary irritation seemed to explain. It would take considerable time before the medical community fully understood the need for protective distance and shielding, limits that seem obvious in hindsight, but were, at the time, genuinely unknown. Meanwhile, the images themselves were slowly improving in quality, a product of countless small refinements rather than any single leap. Tube design evolved gradually, becoming more stable and consistent in the energy it produced. Exposure times shortened as equipment grew more efficient, reducing both the physical discomfort for patients holding still and the risk to everyone in the room. Photographic materials improved as well, becoming more sensitive, capable of capturing clearer detail with less exposure required. Picture a technician of this middle period, several years in, moving through their work with a confidence their predecessors could not have possessed. They knew, almost instinctively now, how to position a patient's limb to avoid the ghostly blur of movement. They knew which exposure settings suited a small hand versus a larger joint, how to account for the particular density of an older patient's bones versus a younger one's, how to read the subtle early signs of equipment nearing failure before it actually did. This was expertise built entirely through repetition, through thousands of small decisions made correctly or incorrectly and learned from either way. Hospitals began to develop something resembling standard procedure during this period, though it remained loose and varied from one institution to another. Some kept meticulous logs of exposure settings paired with outcomes, building their own internal reference libraries. Others relied more heavily on the individual judgment of experienced technicians, passing knowledge down through direct mentorship rather than written record. Both approaches contributed to the slow, collective refinement of practice, happening simultaneously in hospitals scattered across considerable distances, each somewhat isolated from the others, yet all moving gradually in the same direction. The physicians who interpreted these images were developing their own parallel expertise, learning to read the language of light and shadow the way one learns any new visual vocabulary. A properly exposed image told a very particular kind of story, one written not in words, but in gradations of grey, in the sharp edges where bone met softer tissue, in the subtle irregularities that distinguished a healing fracture from one still actively knitting together. This reading skill took years to develop, and the physicians who mastered it became invaluable resources within their hospitals, often consulted specifically for their fluency in a visual language. Not everyone had yet learned to speak. By the later years of this accumulation period, something had genuinely shifted in the culture of medicine itself. The interior of the body, once sealed behind skin and inference, had become a place that could be visited, at least partially, before any incision was made. Surgery was slowly transforming from a practice of discovery into a practice of confirmation. The surgeon arriving at the table already knowing a great deal about what waited beneath the skin. It was not yet complete. Much still remained hidden, particularly the softer tissues this early technology struggled to render clearly. But the foundation had been laid, one exposure and one careful technician at a time. There is a particular satisfaction in studying the mechanical evolution of any technology, watching the way early, fragile versions of a device slowly give way to sturdier, more purposeful designs. This was true of the imaging equipment that took root in hospitals during this period, and the changes, though gradual, transformed both the physical experience of undergoing an examination and the reliability of the results produced. Let us slow down here and examine, piece by piece, exactly how these machines change shape. Picture the earliest equipment again for a moment, before we watch it evolve. A simple glass tube, exposed and unshielded, connected by loose wiring to a power source that itself required careful, hands-on adjustment. There was no housing to speak of, no protective casing. The tube simply sat on a stand or was held in position by hand, vulnerable to bumps, drafts, and the general unpredictability of a working hospital environment. Operating this equipment required a kind of vigilance that modern practitioners would find almost exhausting, a constant low hum of attention paid to every visible and audible signal the fragile apparatus offered. Now imagine the changes that followed, arriving not all at once, but through a steady accumulation of small, practical improvements. The tube itself was gradually enclosed in protective housing, often a heavy metal casing lined with materials designed to contain stray energy and direct it more precisely toward its intended target. This single change carried enormous practical significance. It meant technicians and physicians standing nearby were exposed to considerably less stray energy during each examination. It meant the beam itself became more focused, more predictable, capable of producing sharper, more consistent images with less waste and less need for repeated exposures. Consider the weight and substance of this new housing, a detail easy to overlook but worth sitting with. Where the earliest tubes had been delicate, almost jewel-like in their fragility, the new housed versions carried genuine physical heft. Lifting one required both hands and real effort. Moving one required a cart or fixed mounting, rather than casual repositioning. This shift in physical substance mirrored a broader shift in the technology's status. No longer a fragile laboratory curiosity being cautiously adapted for medical use, but a purpose-built piece of clinical equipment engineered specifically for the demands of repeated hospital use. The stands and mounting systems that held this equipment evolved alongside the tubes themselves, becoming more sophisticated with each passing year. Early stands were often improvised, borrowed or adapted from other laboratory equipment, never designed for this particular purpose. Later versions were purpose-built, featuring adjustable height, rotating arms that could be positioned precisely over different parts of a patient's body, and locking mechanisms that held the equipment steady during the crucial moments of exposure. Imagine the mechanical satisfaction of a well-designed locking joint from this era. A solid, resistant click as it settled into place, offering the operator confidence that nothing would shift during the exposure that followed. Timing mechanisms represented another area of steady mechanical refinement. The earliest exposures had been governed by little more than a technician's counted seconds, an inherently imprecise method that led to significant variation in image quality from one examination to the next. Mechanical timers gradually replaced this rough estimation, small clockwork devices that could be set to interrupt the current automatically after a precise interval had elapsed. Picture the particular satisfaction of watching one of these early timers in operation. A small dial marked with careful gradations, a spring-loaded mechanism winding down with an audible ticking, and then a distinct, satisfying click as the circuit broke and the exposure ended precisely when intended, without any need for human judgment or counting. These mechanical refinements, taken individually, might seem modest, but taken together, across years of steady accumulation, they transformed the practice of medical imaging from something closer to craft dependent heavily on individual skill and intuition, into something closer to a repeatable, dependable procedure. A well-designed machine, properly maintained, could produce consistent results in the hands of a reasonably trained operator, reducing the enormous variability that had characterized the earliest years of the practice. This consistency mattered enormously for medicine's growing confidence in the technology, because consistent, reliable results were precisely what allowed physicians to trust these images enough to base real treatment decisions upon them. Let us turn our attention now to another mechanical thread developing during this same period, one that would eventually prove just as significant as the imaging equipment itself: the gradual mechanization of the operating room surrounding it. Because even as physicians gained this new capacity to see inside the body before treatment began, the actual work of surgery remained, for the most part, a deeply manual craft, and the tools supporting that craft were undergoing their own quiet, steady evolution. Picture the operating table of this middle period, still recognizably related to its predecessors, but incorporating small mechanical improvements that made a real difference in practice. Earlier tables had been largely fixed in position, requiring patients to be physically repositioned, sometimes awkwardly, to give surgeons proper access to different areas of the body. Newer designs incorporated adjustable sections, hinged joints that allowed the table itself to tilt and bend, elevating a patient's upper body or lower limbs through mechanical adjustment rather than manual repositioning. Imagine the particular sound of one of these adjustable tables in operation: a low mechanical groan as a hand crank turned, gears meshing with the deliberate resistance of well-machined metal, the table surface shifting by careful degrees until the correct angle had been achieved. Lighting, too, was undergoing its own steady transformation during this period. The reliance on natural daylight, so central to earlier surgical practice, was gradually giving way to artificial lighting systems designed for the demands of the operating room. Early electric surgical lamps were far from perfect. They generated considerable heat and required careful positioning to avoid uncomfortable glare. But even with these limitations, the shift toward reliable artificial lighting freed surgery from its old dependence on time of day and weather, allowing procedures to be scheduled with a consistency natural light alone could never have provided. Consider the instruments themselves, the actual tools a surgeon held during a procedure, which were also undergoing quiet refinement during this period. Metal alloys improved, producing blades and clamps that held a sharper edge longer and resisted corrosion more effectively than earlier materials. Sterilization equipment developed alongside these improved instruments, steam-based devices that could reliably eliminate contamination in ways that earlier cleaning methods could not guarantee. Picture the particular ritual of preparing instruments in this era. Trays of metal tools arranged with careful precision, lowered into a chamber that sealed shut with a heavy mechanical latch, steam hissing audibly as pressure built inside. And then, after the appropriate interval, the satisfying release of pressure, as the chamber was opened to reveal instruments rendered safe for use. The relationship between this broader mechanical evolution and the imaging equipment developing alongside it was not incidental. Both reflected the same underlying shift in how medicine understood itself during this period. A growing confidence that careful engineering, applied thoughtfully and repeatedly, refined through practical experience, could genuinely improve outcomes for patients. This was not a sudden or dramatic shift in philosophy. It unfolded slowly, machine by machine, refinement by refinement, each small improvement building on the ones that came before it. Imagine, too, the specialized workers who emerged to support this increasingly mechanical environment. Equipment maintenance became its own quiet specialty, requiring individuals who understood not just the medical purpose of these devices, but their mechanical inner workings as well. These maintenance specialists move through hospital corridors with their own particular toolkits, understanding the specific quirks of each piece of equipment under their care, able to diagnose a failing component by sound alone, much the way an experienced mechanic can identify a problem in an engine before it becomes visible. Their work, largely invisible to patients and even to many physicians, formed an essential and steadily growing layer of infrastructure supporting the entire enterprise of modern medical practice. By the later years of this mechanical period, the operating room and the imaging room had both been transformed from spaces defined primarily by manual skill into spaces defined by a careful partnership between human expertise and increasingly reliable machinery. Neither had replaced the other. The surgeon's hands remained as essential as ever, and the technician's trained eye remained irreplaceable in interpreting what the machines produced. But both now worked within an environment considerably more predictable, more consistent, and more capable than the one that had existed only a generation before. There comes a point in the life of any medical practice when scattered, individual expertise must give way to something more organized, more shared, more capable of being taught reliably to the next generation of practitioners. This was the quiet transition beginning to take shape during this period, as hospitals across considerable distances, each having developed their own particular methods through years of independent trial and error, slowly began comparing notes, sharing findings, and working towards something resembling common practice. Picture the earliest professional gatherings dedicated specifically to this new form of medical seeing. Small conferences held in modest halls where practitioners traveled, sometimes considerable distances, to share what they had learned. Imagine the particular energy of one of these early meetings. Technicians and physicians who had spent years working in relative isolation, suddenly discovering how differently the same basic technology had been adapted elsewhere. Exposure settings that one hospital considered standard proved wildly different from another's. Positioning techniques carefully developed through local trial and error sometimes turned out to be needlessly complicated compared to simpler methods discovered independently elsewhere. These early exchanges, however informal, began the slow work of building genuine consensus. Practitioners returned to their own hospitals, carrying new techniques learned from colleagues elsewhere, testing these borrowed methods against their own established practices, keeping what proved superior and discarding what did not. This was standardization, not imposed from above by any central authority, but built gradually from the ground up through countless individual comparisons and adjustments happening simultaneously across many institutions. Consider the emergence of written guidance during this period. Early manuals and reference materials that attempted to capture accumulated best practice in a form that could be studied and applied without requiring years of direct apprenticeship. Picture the physical object of one of these early manuals. Pages dense with careful diagrams showing proper patient positioning, tables listing recommended exposure settings for different parts of the body, cautionary notes about common errors and how to avoid them. These documents represented something genuinely new. Knowledge that had previously existed only in the hands and memories of experienced individual practitioners, now captured in a form that could travel independently, reaching hospitals and technicians who had never met the original experts whose hard-won experience filled these pages. The training of new technicians began to formalize alongside this written guidance, where earlier practitioners had learned almost entirely through direct, informal apprenticeship, watching and gradually absorbing the skills of an experienced mentor. Structured training programs began to emerge, combining written instruction with supervised practical experience in a more deliberate, organized sequence. Imagine a new trainee moving through one of these early structured programs, first studying diagrams and written procedures, then observing experienced technicians at work, then finally being permitted to conduct examinations themselves under close supervision, each stage building carefully on the one before it, rather than relying on whatever informal opportunities happened to arise. This formalization carried real benefits, extending competent practice to a wider range of practitioners than the older apprenticeship model alone could have supported. A hospital in a smaller or more remote location no longer needed direct access to one of the original pioneering experts to develop reasonably skilled technicians of its own. Written guidance and structured training could bridge that gap, spreading accumulated expertise considerably faster and more evenly than the slow, personal transmission of skill from mentor to individual apprentice had previously allowed. Yet, something was also lost in this transition towards standardization, even as much was gained. The earlier era's intense, almost artisanal relationship between a skilled technician and their particular equipment, built through years of close daily attention, began to give way to a more generalized, transferable set of skills applicable across a wider range of standardized equipment. This was, on balance, a genuine improvement for medicine as a whole, extending reliable practice to far more patients than the older model could have reached. But there remains something worth honoring in the memory of those earlier specialists, the ones who knew their particular temperamental machine so intimately they could diagnose its failing health by sound alone, a form of expertise that standardization, for all its benefits, could never fully replicate or preserve. Let us settle further into this era of standardization, because it holds a particular kind of quiet significance, often overlooked in favor of more dramatic moments of discovery. This was the period when medical imaging stopped being a remarkable exception, practiced only in the largest and most well-resourced institutions, and slowly became something closer to an ordinary, expected part of medical care, available to a much broader population of patients. Picture the gradual expansion of dedicated imaging departments during this time, moving from a single converted room tucked into a corner of a hospital towards something resembling a genuine department with multiple pieces of equipment, several trained technicians, and a physician or two whose primary responsibility involved interpreting the images produced. This growth reflected a broader shift in how hospitals themselves understood the value of imaging. No longer a curiosity worth housing in whatever space could be spared, but a core clinical function deserving genuine institutional investment and dedicated physical space. Consider the physical layout of one of these more developed imaging departments, designed with considerably more intention than the improvised spaces of earlier years. Separate rooms now existed for different purposes. One for the actual examination, kept appropriately dark and shielded. Another for processing the photographic plates. Still another serving as a waiting area where patients might sit before their turn arrived. This physical separation reflected a growing understanding of workflow, an appreciation that different stages of the process required different environments, and that thoughtful physical organization could meaningfully improve both efficiency and the quality of results produced. Record keeping developed considerably during this period as well, moving from the informal, scattered notes of earlier years toward more systematic archives. Imagine the particular satisfaction of a well-organized filing system from this era. Sturdy folders holding photographic plates and accompanying notes, arranged carefully by patient and date, stored in cabinets designed specifically to protect the fragile glass plates from breakage or degradation. This growing archive served multiple purposes beyond simple record keeping. It allowed physicians to compare a patient's current condition against earlier images, tracking the progress of healing or the development of a concern over time in a way that memory and touch alone could never have provided. It also became, gradually, a resource for training, a library of examples that new practitioners could study to develop their own diagnostic eye. The relationship between imaging departments and surgical practice deepened considerably during this period of standardization as well. What had once been a somewhat separate, specialized service, consulted occasionally, now became woven more thoroughly into the routine preparation for many surgical procedures. Surgeons developed the habit of reviewing available images before entering the operating room, incorporating this visual information into their planning as a matter of course rather than exception. This shift changed the actual rhythm of surgical practice itself, adding a deliberate, preparatory stage that had simply not existed in the earlier era of purely exploratory operation. Picture too the quiet professional pride that began developing among those who worked in these increasingly established imaging departments. What had once been considered a somewhat unusual, even slightly mysterious specialty was gaining genuine recognition as a distinct and valuable medical discipline in its own right. Technicians who had entered the field during its uncertain early years, when equipment was fragile and methods varied wildly from one hospital to the next, could now look back on a period of remarkable consolidation, watching their once improvised craft settle into something resembling a mature, respected profession with its own established standards, its own body of shared knowledge, and its own clear pathway for training the practitioners who would carry it forward. By the close of this standardization period, the foundation for a genuinely reliable, reproducible practice of medical imaging had been firmly established. The wild variation of the earliest years had given way to shared methods, shared training, and shared expectations about what a properly conducted examination should produce. This consistency would prove essential for what came next, because the coming era would ask this technology to do something considerably more ambitious than simply photographing bone. It would ask imaging to begin seeing motion, seeing process, seeing the body, not as a single frozen moment, but as something dynamic, living, and continuously changing. The body, as we ever come to understand it through the earliest decades of medical imaging, had so far only been captured in single frozen moments, a bone rendered still and silent on a photographic plate, a shape suspended in permanent stillness the instant an exposure was made. But the living body is never actually still. It breathes, it pulses, its organs contract and release in rhythms that a single frozen image, however clear, could never fully convey. And so began a quiet, technically demanding pursuit, the desire not simply to see the body, but to watch it move. Picture the engineering challenge this presented. The earlier photographic method required a meaningful pause, an exposure time during which the subject needed to remain motionless for the image to render cleanly. Watching motion required something fundamentally different, a continuous, real-time view, rather than a single captured instant. Researchers began experimenting with fluorescent screens that could glow continuously under a steady, lower intensity stream of energy, rather than requiring the brief, concentrated burst of photographic exposure demanded. The resulting image was fainter, dimmer, and required the viewer's eyes to adjust to a particular kind of low, glowing dimness. But it was, remarkably, continuous. It moved as the body moved. Imagine a physician standing before one of these early, continuous viewing screens for the first time, watching a patient swallow and seeing in real time the passage of that swallow traveling down through the throat and into the stomach below. This was an entirely new category of observation, unlike anything the static photograph could offer. A swallowed object's exact path could now be tracked as it moved, rather than inferred from a single still image showing only its final resting position. Consider the particular atmosphere of the rooms where this continuous viewing took place. Unlike the brief, businesslike efficiency of the earlier photographic examination, this new form of viewing required sustained darkness, sustained attention, and often a considerably longer period of direct exposure for both patient and physician alike. The room itself took on an almost hushed, reverent quality. The soft, pale glow of the viewing screen, the only significant source of light. The physician leaning close, watching with quiet concentration as the hidden architecture of a living body moved and shifted in real time before their eyes. This new capability carried its own particular costs, ones the medical community was still learning to fully appreciate. The continuous nature of this viewing method meant considerably longer periods of exposure than the earlier brief photographic method had required. An understanding of the cumulative risk this posed to both patients and the physicians conducting repeated examinations was still developing. This period saw genuine, careful attention paid to balancing the remarkable diagnostic value of continuous viewing against the real physical cost of prolonged exposure, a balance that would continue to be refined for years as protective measures and more efficient equipment gradually reduced the risk involved. Alongside this pursuit of motion, another thread was quietly developing as well, one that would eventually prove just as significant, though its origins lay in an entirely different physical principle. Researchers working with sound waves, particularly frequencies too high for the human ear to detect, discovered that these silent, inaudible waves behaved in interesting and useful ways when directed into different materials. They reflected differently depending on what they encountered, bouncing back in patterns that varied according to the density and composition of whatever lay in their path. This principle, first explored for entirely unrelated industrial purposes, would eventually find its way into medicine as well, offering something the earlier imaging methods could not, a way of seeing that required no exposure at all, no fluorescent glow, no photographic plate, only silence, and the careful, patient interpretation of echoes bouncing back from structures no eye could directly observe. The convergence of these two threads, the pursuit of continuous motion and the quiet exploration of silent, reflected sound, would together define the next great chapter in medicine's long relationship with the hidden interior of the body. Neither arrived fully formed. Both required years of careful, incremental refinement before becoming genuinely reliable clinical tools. But together, they represented something the earliest photographic pioneers could not have fully anticipated, a future in which the body could be observed not merely as a frozen shadow of bone, but as a living, moving, breathing system, witnessed in its own continuous unfolding. Let us return now to that second thread mentioned before, the one built not from energy passing through matter, but from sound reflecting off it. Sound waves, particularly those pitched too high for human hearing, carry a particular kind of usefulness that had already found application in entirely unrelated fields. most notably in locating objects underwater, where the surrounding medium allowed such waves to travel considerable distances before encountering something solid enough to reflect them back. Picture the basic mechanism at the heart of this approach. A small device, often called a transducer, generates a brief pulse of sound at a frequency well beyond what any human ear could detect, directing this pulse into whatever material lies ahead of it. When that pulse encounters a boundary between two different substances, say the edge between soft tissue and fluid, or the boundary of an organ against the material surrounding it, a portion of the sound wave reflects back toward its source. The device listens for this returning echo, measuring the time it takes to return and the strength of the signal. And from this simple, elegant principle, a picture can gradually be constructed. Consider how fundamentally different this method felt from the imaging approaches that preceded it. There was no visible glow, no photographic exposure, no fluorescent screen lighting a darkened room. The entire process unfolded in genuine silence, at least to human ears, the transducer sending and receiving pulses far too rapid and too high-pitched for anyone in the room to hear directly. Imagine the particular quality of a room where this new form of imaging was taking place. Quiet, unremarkable, without any of the dramatic glow or hum associated with the earlier photographic methods. And yet, on a nearby screen, a picture was slowly forming nonetheless, built entirely from the patient accumulation of countless silent echoes. The earliest applications of this sound-based approach in medicine were tentative and limited, constrained by equipment that could only produce fairly crude representations of what lay beneath the skin. But the appeal was immediately obvious to anyone who understood its underlying principle. Unlike the earlier imaging methods, this approach required no exposure of any kind, no cumulative risk building with repeated use. It could, in principle, be applied as often as clinically necessary without the careful weighing of risk against benefit that had shaped so much of the earlier era's practice. Picture the technicians and researchers working to refine this new method, adjusting the frequency and intensity of the sound pulses, experimenting with different ways of translating the pattern of returning echoes into something a physician could actually interpret visually. Early results often resembled little more than shifting patterns of light and shadow, requiring considerable interpretive skill and no small amount of imagination to connect the pattern on the screen with the actual structure it represented. But with each refinement, the images grew steadily clearer, the correspondence between echo pattern and physical structure becoming more reliable and more useful. This quiet, silent method of seeing would eventually prove particularly valuable in situations where the earlier imaging approaches were poorly suited or genuinely inappropriate. Because it involved no exposure of the kind associated with the photographic method, it found particular value in monitoring conditions where repeated, frequent observation was necessary, and where the cumulative risk of other methods made such frequent monitoring genuinely unwise. It also proved uniquely capable of revealing certain kinds of soft tissue detail that the earlier bone-favoring photographic method had always struggled to capture clearly. opening a window into portions of the body's interior that had remained stubbornly difficult to observe throughout the earlier decades of imaging development. By the close of this period of silent transition, medicine possessed something considerably more complete than it had at the century's earlier turning point. The static photograph remained invaluable for its particular strengths, especially in revealing the dense architecture of bone. Continuous viewing offered its own distinct value in observing motion and process. And this newest, quietest method offered yet another distinct capability, revealing soft structure without exposure, without the dramatic glow of earlier techniques, built instead from nothing more than patient, careful listening to echoes too high-pitched for any human ear to perceive directly. Together, these complementary methods represented a body of seeing capability that would have seemed, to the earliest pioneers working with fragile glass tubes in darkened rooms, almost beyond imagining. Every remarkable capability requires, somewhere beneath its visible surface, an entire supporting structure most people never think about. The pipes and wires and quiet logistics that make the visible achievement possible at all. Medical imaging was no exception. Behind every clear photograph of bone, every continuous glowing view of motion, every silent echo translated into a readable picture, sat an enormous, largely invisible infrastructure that had been steadily built up over years of careful, unglamorous work. Picture the electrical demands alone that this growing practice placed on hospitals during this period. The earliest equipment had required only modest power, but as machines grew more sophisticated and more capable of producing clearer, more detailed images, their electrical appetite grew correspondingly larger. Hospitals found themselves needing to upgrade their electrical systems specifically to accommodate imaging departments, running dedicated wiring capable of handling loads that far exceeded what the rest of the building typically required. Imagine the particular hum of a hospital's electrical infrastructure during this period. A low, steady undertone running beneath the more obvious sounds of daily hospital life, powering an increasingly complex web of specialized equipment. Consider, too, the quiet infrastructure of supply that kept these departments functioning day after day. Photographic plates, and later, flexible film required steady, reliable sourcing, along with the chemical solutions needed to develop them properly. Transducers and delicate electronic components required their own specialized maintenance and occasional replacement. None of this simply appeared when needed. It required careful planning, established relationships with suppliers, storage space for materials needing protection from light, humidity, or damage, and staff trained specifically in managing these logistical demands. Picture the emergence of an entirely new category of specialized worker during this period. The individual responsible not for operating the equipment directly, nor for interpreting the images it produced, but for ensuring that everything needed to keep the department running smoothly remained reliably in place. These logistics specialists tracked inventory, anticipated future needs, based on patterns of use, coordinated deliveries, and maintained the careful records necessary to keep an increasingly complex department functioning without the kind of interruption that could delay patient care. Their work rarely received recognition, yet without it, the more visible achievements of the imaging department would have been impossible to sustain. The physical space required for imaging departments also grew considerably during this period, extending well beyond the examination and processing rooms themselves. Storage areas for chemicals and materials needed their own dedicated ventilation, designed to safely manage the fumes produced during photographic processing. Record archives required space that continued to expand year after year as hospitals accumulated growing libraries of patient images that needed to remain accessible for future comparison. Waiting areas grew larger as patient volume increased, requiring their own furniture, their own staff, their own careful management of flow to keep an increasingly busy department operating smoothly. Training infrastructure deepened as well during this period, extending beyond the individual hospital to something resembling genuine educational institutions dedicated specifically to preparing new practitioners for this field. Imagine the particular atmosphere of one of these early dedicated training programs. Classrooms filled with diagrams and equipment specifically designed for instructional purposes. Supervised practice sessions where students worked under close guidance before ever touching equipment used on an actual patient, and a growing body of accumulated case studies used to teach the subtle art of interpretation that no written manual alone could fully convey. By the later years of this infrastructure building period, medical imaging had become something considerably more substantial than a collection of remarkable individual techniques. It had become a genuine system, supported by dedicated electrical capacity, reliable supply chains, specialized logistics workers, purpose-built physical space, and formal educational institutions, all working together to sustain a practice that had, only a few decades earlier, existed as little more than a fragile curiosity in a handful of scattered laboratories. This quiet, unglamorous infrastructure rarely receives the attention given to the more dramatic moments of discovery, but without it, none of those earlier discoveries could have grown into the reliable, widespread practice that medicine had, by this point, come to depend upon. Let us look more closely now at one particular piece of this growing infrastructure that deserves special attention: the quiet, methodical world of maintenance and calibration, the ongoing work required simply to keep existing equipment functioning reliably day after day, year after year. Discovery captures attention. Maintenance rarely does. And yet, without this steady, unglamorous labor, none of the earlier breakthroughs could have translated into anything resembling dependable, everyday medical practice. Picture the daily rituals of an experienced maintenance technician moving through an imaging department before the first patient of the day arrived. Equipment needed to be checked systematically, each component tested against established standards to ensure it remained within acceptable operating parameters. A tube that had drifted slightly out of calibration might still function, technically, but the images it produced would carry subtle inconsistencies that could complicate diagnosis or require repeated examinations. Catching these small drifts before they affected patient care required genuine expertise, an intimate familiarity with how each specific piece of equipment behaved when functioning correctly, and a trained sensitivity to the subtle signs that something had begun to shift. Consider the particular vocabulary that developed among these maintenance specialists, a shared professional language built from years of accumulated hands-on experience. They spoke of equipment in terms that might sound almost personal to an outsider. A machine that ran hot, another that had grown sluggish in its response, a particular tube that required coaxing to reach its full operating capacity. This language reflected genuine expertise, a deep familiarity built through repeated, careful attention that no written manual alone could fully substitute for, however detailed that manual might be. Calibration itself involved a careful, systematic process of comparison, checking equipment output against known standards to ensure consistency both within a single machine over time and across different machines within the same department, or even different hospitals entirely. Imagine the particular satisfaction of a successful calibration session. A technician working through a careful sequence of tests, watching indicators settle precisely within their expected ranges, confirming that the equipment could be trusted to produce reliable, consistent results for the patients who would depend on it in the hours and days that followed. This infrastructure of maintenance and calibration carried enormous practical significance for medicine's growing confidence in imaging technology as a whole. A physician reviewing an image needed genuine trust that what they were seeing accurately reflected the patient's actual condition, rather than some artifact of poorly calibrated equipment. This trust could not simply be assumed. It had to be earned and continuously maintained through the patient, systematic work of technicians whose names rarely appeared in any patient record, yet whose careful attention made every subsequent diagnosis and treatment decision genuinely trustworthy. Record keeping around maintenance itself became its own specialized discipline during this period. Detailed logs tracking every calibration session, every repair, every replacement of a worn component. These records served multiple purposes beyond simple accountability. They allowed patterns to emerge over time, revealing which components tended to wear most quickly, which environmental conditions seemed to accelerate, equipment degradation, which maintenance schedules produced the most reliable long-term performance. This accumulated data, gathered patiently across years of careful record keeping, gradually transformed equipment maintenance from a reactive practice, responding only when something visibly failed, into something closer to a predictive discipline, anticipating problems before they actually occurred. By the later years of this infrastructure period, the invisible labor supporting medical imaging had grown into something genuinely sophisticated in its own right. A discipline with its own accumulated expertise, its own specialized vocabulary, its own careful systems for ensuring reliability. This foundation, built patiently and largely without public recognition, made possible everything that would follow in the decades ahead. The remarkable images that physicians increasingly relied upon rested, ultimately, on this quiet and largely invisible labor of careful, patient maintenance. Knowledge, once it has been established in one place, does not naturally remain confined there. It travels, carried by curious minds eager to understand, by professionals seeking to improve their own practice, by the simple, persistent human tendency to share genuinely useful discoveries with others facing similar challenges elsewhere. This was true of medical imaging as much as any other significant advance, and the story of how this practice spread across considerable distances, crossing barriers of language and geography and differing medical traditions, deserves its own careful attention. Picture the early channels through which this knowledge traveled before faster communication existed. Written correspondence between practitioners in different regions, carried across considerable distances by mail that might take weeks or even months to arrive. Scientific journals, painstakingly translated from one language into another, allowing findings developed in one part of the world to reach practitioners who had never met the original researchers and might never have the opportunity to do so directly. Visiting scholars, traveling considerable distances, specifically to observe practices in hospitals with particular expertise, then returning home to adapt and implement what they had learned within their own institutions. Consider the particular challenges this cross-regional exchange presented. Challenges that went well beyond simple language translation. Different regions had developed their own particular equipment traditions, their own preferred approaches to certain procedures, their own accumulated body of practical wisdom built through years of independent local experience. A technique that worked beautifully in one hospital's particular equipment and environmental conditions might require careful adaptation before it could be successfully applied elsewhere, requiring practitioners to understand not just what worked, but why it worked, so the underlying principle could be translated into a different context. Picture, too, the establishment of international gatherings during this period. Conferences that brought together practitioners from considerably distant regions to share findings, compare methods, and build the kind of personal professional relationships that written correspondence alone could never fully replicate. Imagine the particular atmosphere of one of these early international gatherings. A hall filled with practitioners who had traveled considerable distances, some hearing entirely unfamiliar accents and encountering entirely unfamiliar approaches for the first time, all united by a shared fascination with this relatively young field and a genuine eagerness to learn from colleagues whose daily practical experience differed from their own in sometimes surprising ways. These international exchanges revealed something valuable that might not have been obvious from within any single region's isolated practice. The recognition the different traditions had each developed genuine strengths worth learning from, rather than any single approach representing the correct method to which all others should simply conform. One region might have developed particularly refined techniques for a certain kind of examination, born from local circumstances that had pushed practitioners toward creative solutions others had not needed to develop. This genuine mutual exchange enriched the field considerably, building a shared body of accumulated knowledge deeper than any single region could have developed, working entirely in isolation. The translation of technical terminology itself became its own quiet, careful discipline during this period. As practitioners worked to establish shared vocabulary that could travel reliably across different languages without losing crucial precision. Technical committees debated the precise meaning of specific terms, working to ensure that a word describing a particular finding carried exactly the same clinical significance, whether read in one language or another. Understanding that imprecise translation in this field carried real consequences for patient care. By the later years of this period of global connection, medical imaging had genuinely become an international discipline. Its knowledge base, built collaboratively from contributions arriving from considerably distant corners of the world, its practitioners increasingly aware that their own local practice existed within a much larger, shared community of professionals working toward common goals despite real differences in language, culture, and available resources. This global connection would prove essential for everything that followed, ensuring that future advances, wherever they first emerged, could spread more quickly and reach more patients than earlier, more isolated discoveries ever could have. Let us stay a while longer with this idea of global connection, because it produced something beyond the simple spread of technique from one hospital to another. It produced, gradually and almost imperceptibly, a genuine shift in how practitioners around the world understood their relationship to one another, moving from isolated professionals working within the boundaries of their own institutions towards something resembling a shared, interconnected community, bound together by common purpose despite considerable physical distance. Picture the particular experience of a practitioner working in a smaller, more isolated hospital during this period, one without easy access to the larger institutions where much of the field's advancement was concentrated. For such a practitioner, the growing network of shared journals, translated manuals, and occasional visiting experts represented something genuinely valuable, a lifeline connecting their local practice to a much larger body of accumulated knowledge they could never have developed entirely on their own. Imagine the quiet satisfaction of receiving a journal from a distant region, reading through carefully translated findings, and recognizing a solution to a problem that had puzzled the local staff for months, a solution developed independently by colleagues who would likely never meet in person, yet whose careful work had traveled far enough to make a genuine difference. Consider, too, the particular role that equipment manufacturers played in this global spread, though their contribution rarely receives the attention given to the practitioners and researchers themselves. As manufacturing capacity grew and international shipping became more reliable, equipment itself began traveling considerable distances, allowing hospitals in regions without their own manufacturing capability to acquire machines built elsewhere. This physical spread of equipment carried its own particular significance, ensuring that the theoretical knowledge traveling through journals and conferences could actually be applied in practice rather than remaining purely academic for hospitals lacking access to the equipment itself. Picture the particular challenges this equipment distribution presented. Challenges that required their own careful, patient solutions. Machines built in one region needed servicing and replacement parts, creating a genuine need for international supply networks capable of reaching considerably distant locations reliably. Training materials needed to accompany this equipment, ensuring that hospitals receiving unfamiliar machines had access to the knowledge needed to operate them safely and effectively. This entire supporting apparatus, largely invisible to patients receiving care, represented years of careful, deliberate work building the practical infrastructure needed to make global knowledge sharing genuinely useful rather than merely theoretical. The exchange of trained personnel represented another significant thread in this period of global connection. Practitioners traveling considerable distances, not merely to observe, but to work directly within hospitals in other regions, bringing their own particular expertise while absorbing new knowledge from their temporary colleagues. Imagine the particular experience of one of these visiting practitioners, adjusting not only to unfamiliar equipment and procedures, but to an entirely different hospital culture, different patient populations, different resource constraints that shaped how care was actually delivered in this new setting. These exchanges built genuine, lasting professional relationships that continued long after the visiting practitioner returned home, creating durable connections that would continue facilitating knowledge exchange for years afterward. By the later years of this global connection period, the field of medical imaging had developed something genuinely remarkable in its collaborative character, a discipline where a genuinely useful discovery, wherever it first emerged, could reasonably be expected to eventually reach practitioners in considerably distant regions, adapted appropriately for local conditions, but ultimately benefiting from the same underlying insight. This interconnected quality would prove essential for the field's continued development, ensuring that no single region's limitations could permanently constrain what the field as a whole might eventually achieve, and that practitioners everywhere could draw upon a genuinely global body of accumulated wisdom rather than remaining confined to whatever their own local circumstances happen to provide. Let us pause now, having traced the practical development of this remarkable capability, and sit for a while with something quieter and more reflective. The deeper philosophical questions that medical imaging raised, questions that extended well beyond the purely technical achievement of rendering the body's interior visible. Because to see inside a living body for the first time is not merely a technical accomplishment. It touches something more fundamental about how people understand privacy, vulnerability, and the very boundaries of the self. Consider the ancient assumption, held quietly across countless generations and countless cultures, that the interior of the body belonged to a category of knowledge fundamentally different from the exterior. The face, the hands, the general shape of a person. These were public, visible, shared freely with the world simply by existing among others. But what lay beneath the skin had always belonged to a different category entirely. Private not through active concealment, but through simple physical impossibility. No one could see their own heart beating, their own bones articulating beneath muscle, without cutting themselves open. This particular boundary had felt for the entire span of human history before this development, as fixed and unquestionable as any physical law. Picture what it meant then, for this ancient boundary to suddenly become permeable. The interior of the body, once protected by nothing more than the simple physical fact that light could not pass through flesh, now stood revealed through methods that made that old protection functionally obsolete. This shift carried genuine philosophical weight, prompting quiet reflection among thoughtful practitioners and patients alike about what privacy actually meant. Now that the body's most fundamental boundary had proven, in a real and technical sense, no boundary at all. Consider too the particular relationship this new capability created between patient and practitioner, a relationship that carried its own subtle ethical dimensions worth careful attention. To possess an image of someone's interior, their bones, their organs, the hidden architecture that even they themselves had never directly witnessed, created a particular kind of intimacy, an access to knowledge about a person that exceeded, in some genuine sense, what that person possessed about themselves. This intimacy demanded a corresponding sense of responsibility, an understanding that this new capability, however valuable for treatment, also carried the weight of genuine vulnerability entrusted by patient to practitioner. Imagine, too, the quiet unease this capability sometimes provoked in patients themselves, even those who fully understood and appreciated its clinical value. There is something genuinely strange about seeing an image of one's own skeleton, one's own hidden interior, rendered visible on a screen or photographic plate for the very first time. Many patients describe this experience in language that went beyond simple clinical curiosity, touching instead on something closer to existential reflection, a confrontation with the physical reality underlying their own continued existence, the literal architecture that had, until this moment, remained entirely theoretical to their own direct experience. Philosophers and physicians alike, during this period, began writing thoughtfully about what this new capability meant for humanity's broader relationship with mortality and physical vulnerability. To see one's own bones, the same bones that would eventually remain long after the rest of the body had faded, carried an unavoidable reminder of physical finitude that many found genuinely affecting, whether that effect manifested as anxiety, curiosity, or a kind of sober acceptance. This capability, in other words, did not merely serve medicine's practical needs. It touched something considerably deeper in the human relationship with embodiment itself, prompting reflection that extended well beyond any single patient's particular diagnosis or treatment. These philosophical questions did not resolve neatly, nor should we expect them to have. They remain, in many respects, genuinely open questions today, threads worth continuing to pull at even now, long after the initial strangeness of seeing inside a living body has become, for most people, simply an unremarkable part of ordinary medical care. But it is worth remembering, as we continue this exploration, that this capability we now take almost entirely for granted once represented a genuine philosophical rupture, a fundamental reconsideration of boundaries that had felt, for the entire span of human history preceding it, permanently fixed. Let us continue sitting with this philosophical dimension a while longer, because there is another thread worth exploring carefully: the way this new capability reshaped the relationship between certainty and humility within medical practice itself. For centuries, as we discussed earlier in this account, healers had operated within a culture that necessarily accepted deep uncertainty as the ordinary condition of their work. This new capability for seeing offered something that felt, at first, like the promise of genuine certainty, but the reality proved considerably more nuanced and worth examining closely. Consider what it actually meant to possess a clear image of a patient's interior. It offered enormously more information than touch and inference alone could provide, certainly. But an image, however clear, still required interpretation, and interpretation still carried the possibility of error, disagreement, and genuine ambiguity. A shadow on an image might represent one condition to an experienced eye, and something entirely different to a less practiced one. Two skilled physicians examining the same image might reasonably disagree about its precise meaning, particularly in borderline cases where the visual evidence did not point unambiguously toward a single conclusion. The texture and density of a shadow, the way its edges blurred gently into surrounding tissue rather than terminating sharply, the subtle asymmetry between one side of the body and the other, all of this required a trained eye capable of noticing details that a less experienced observer might pass over entirely. Picture, then, the particular kind of humility this new reality demanded from a profession that might have reasonably expected imaging to eliminate uncertainty altogether. The interior of the body was no longer entirely hidden, true, but seeing was not the same as fully understanding, and the gap between these two things between visibility and comprehension became its own subject of careful, ongoing study within the profession. Physicians learned gradually that this new capability had not replaced clinical judgment, but had transformed it, adding a new and enormously valuable source of information that still required the same careful, trained interpretation that touch and observation had always demanded. Consider, too, the particular danger this new capability introduced, one that thoughtful practitioners recognized and worked carefully to guard against. There existed a genuine temptation to overtrust the visual evidence and image provided, to treat what could be seen as more reliable than what could be felt or inferred through other means, simply because visual evidence carries a particular kind of persuasive weight in human perception generally. But an image captured only a single moment, a single angle, a single interpretation of the complex reality it represented. The most thoughtful practitioners of this period worked carefully to maintain a balanced perspective, treating imaging as one valuable source of information among several, rather than as an infallible replacement for the fuller clinical picture that careful, comprehensive examination had always required. Imagine, too, the particular wisdom that developed among the most experienced practitioners of this era, a wisdom built from integrating this new capability without losing the older skills that had served medicine well for centuries. These practitioners learned to move fluidly between what an image revealed and what their trained hands and careful questioning of a patient could reveal in turn, understanding that the fullest, most reliable picture of a patient's condition emerged from thoughtfully combining multiple sources of evidence rather than relying exclusively on any single method, however remarkable that method might seem in isolation. This integration of old and new skill, this careful balance between visual evidence and clinical judgment, represents perhaps the most significant philosophical achievement of this entire era of development. Medicine did not simply replace one set of tools with another. It learned, through years of careful practice and honest reflection, how to hold multiple forms of knowledge simultaneously, weighing each appropriately according to the particular circumstances of each individual patient. This lesson, developed specifically through the introduction of imaging technology, would prove valuable well beyond this particular field, offering a template for how medicine might thoughtfully integrate future advances without losing the essential human judgment that no technology, however remarkable, could ever fully replace. Having traced this long, patient journey from complete blindness to a sophisticated, integrated practice of seeing inside the living body, let us turn our attention now toward what lay ahead, understanding always that any glimpse of the future is necessarily incomplete, built from the reasonable extrapolation of trends already visible, rather than certain knowledge of what would actually unfold. Even so, certain directions were becoming clear by the close of the era we have spent this evening exploring, directions worth considering carefully as we bring this long account toward its close. Picture the continued refinement of the imaging methods already established, each one likely to grow steadily more capable, more detailed, and less burdensome for the patients undergoing examination. The photographic method, already considerably refined from its earliest fragile beginnings, seemed likely to continue improving in resolution and clarity, revealing ever finer detail within the body's dense structures. Continuous viewing, already valuable for observing motion, seemed poised to become safer and more efficient, extending its usefulness to an even broader range of clinical situations as the risks associated with prolonged exposure continued to diminish through careful engineering. Imagine, too, the gradual miniaturization that seemed likely to follow, equipment growing smaller and more portable, eventually allowing forms of examination that had once required a dedicated hospital department to be conducted in far more modest settings, bringing this remarkable capability closer to patients who might otherwise have needed to travel considerable distances simply to be examined. Consider, too, the quiet promise held by the sound-based method, still relatively young by comparison to its photographic predecessor. Its complete absence of exposure risk made it an obvious candidate for continued refinement and expanded application, particularly as the technology for translating returning echoes into clear, interpretable images continued to improve. Practitioners of this era could reasonably anticipate that this silent method would eventually reveal soft tissue detail with a clarity that early, crude versions could only hint at, opening portions of the body's interior that remained frustratingly difficult to observe through the methods developed earlier. Imagine, too, the possibility of imaging methods not yet even conceived during this period, approaches built from physical principles not yet fully understood or applied to medical purposes. History had already demonstrated, through the very story we have traced this evening, that useful medical technology often emerged from unexpected directions, from laboratory curiosities pursued initially for reasons entirely unrelated to medicine. There was no particular reason to assume this pattern would not continue, that future decades might not bring entirely new methods of seeing built from principles as yet unimagined by even the most forward-thinking practitioners of this particular period. Picture, too, the continued evolution of how these various imaging methods might eventually work together, complementing one another's particular strengths, rather than existing as entirely separate, competing approaches. A physician of some future era might reasonably combine several different forms of imaging for a single patient, drawing on the particular strengths of each method to build a more complete picture than any single approach could provide alone. This kind of integrated, complementary practice seemed a natural extension of trends already visible by the close of this era, as practitioners increasingly understood that different methods revealed genuinely different aspects of the body's hidden interior. Consider, finally, the broader implications. This continued development might carry for the relationship between technology and clinical judgment that we explored earlier in this account. As imaging methods grew more sophisticated, the challenge of maintaining appropriate humility, of treating powerful visual evidence as one valuable source of information among several, rather than an infallible final word, seemed likely to grow correspondingly more important rather than less. The wisdom developed carefully during the earlier decades of this technology's introduction, the understanding that seeing is not the same as fully comprehending, would remain essential guidance for whatever remarkable new capabilities the future might eventually bring. We have traveled a considerable distance this evening, tracing a long, patient arc from an era of complete blindness through decades of accumulated discovery, mechanical refinement, standardization, quiet infrastructure, global collaboration, and careful philosophical reflection. Let us spend these final moments looking back across that entire journey, considering what it might teach us as we prepare to let this particular story rest. Consider first the sheer duration of the transformation we have traced. This was not a single dramatic moment, but a long, unfolding process spanning many decades, built from countless individual contributions, most made by people whose names history has not preserved, each one adding some small, incremental improvement to a shared, accumulating body of knowledge. The surgeon working blind in that distant operating room we described at the very beginning of this account could scarcely have imagined the sophisticated, integrated practice that would eventually emerge from the patient accumulation of so many small advances made by so many careful hands across so many years. Picture 2, the particular character of the people who carried this transformation forward. The researchers pursuing strange laboratory curiosities without fully understanding their eventual significance. The technicians developing intimate, almost personal relationships with fragile, temperamental equipment. The physicians learning to read an entirely new visual language built from gradations of light and shadow. The maintenance specialists whose quiet, unglamorous labor kept the entire enterprise functioning reliably. None of these individuals worked alone. Each contribution depended on countless others, a vast, largely invisible collaboration, spanning considerable distances and considerable time. Think too of the patients themselves, moving through this long history as quiet participants rather than passive subjects, trusting unfamiliar equipment and unfamiliar procedures, holding still through uncomfortable examinations, and in doing so, contributing their own small part to the accumulated understanding that made every subsequent examination a little more reliable than the one before it. Consider the particular textures we have lingered over this evening. The fragile glow of an early glass tube in a darkened laboratory, the mineral scent of a photographic developing room, the low mechanical groan of an adjustable operating table settling into place, the silent, inaudible pulse of sound waves traveling into tissue and returning as a readable echo. Each of these small, sensory details represents a genuine moment of human effort, a person somewhere, at some point, working carefully and patiently to solve a problem that mattered enormously to someone else's well-being, even if that person's name has long since faded from any record we might consult tonight. Consider, finally, the particular quality of patience this entire story demonstrates, a patience worth carrying forward into our own understanding of how meaningful change actually happens. The transformation we have traced this evening did not arrive through any single dramatic breakthrough, however much popular memory might prefer to simplify complex histories into single, tidy moments of discovery. It arrived through sustained, careful, often unglamorous effort, through the willingness of countless people to keep refining, keep testing, keep patiently building on what came before, even when the ultimate significance of their particular contribution remained, at the time, genuinely unclear. This, perhaps, is the quietest and most enduring lesson this long history offers. Meaningful transformation rarely announces itself with obvious drama. It accumulates slowly and steadily through the patient, careful work of people willing to contribute their particular piece to something considerably larger than themselves, trusting that their contribution, however modest it might seem in isolation, would eventually become part of something genuinely significant when combined with the equally patient contributions of countless others working alongside them across considerable time and distance. As we let this story settle now into rest, consider the quiet body resting wherever you are tonight, breathing steadily, its hidden architecture no longer entirely mysterious the way it once was to every generation before this remarkable, patient unfolding of careful human curiosity. There is something worth appreciating in that fact, something worth carrying gently into whatever rest awaits you now, as this long account of patient discovery finally, quietly, comes to its close. And so, the narrative of this assembly comes to its quiet conclusion. Whether you are still awake, or whether you have already drifted into a deep and peaceful sleep, know that you are exactly where you need to be. The world is vast, but tonight, its systems are simply the backdrop to your rest. Thank you for joining me here at Quietly Made. Rest now. Join us again tomorrow. Good night.